The next method we need to add is the method to update the user. So if you remember the add new user and the update user, those two methods in our, let's go into the service implementation. You remember they're very similar, right? So you can see this is the add new user and update new user. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this and make some modification to it. So I'm going to copy it and paste it down here. And then first thing I'm going to rename it. So it's going to be update. And that's also going to be update, like the path. So this is add and this is update. And one other piece of information that I'm going to need is going to be the current username. So I'm going to copy the first one and then paste it. And then I'm going to change this to current username and copy it and paste it in here as well as the current username, right? And then once I have the current username, I can actually call the update instead of the add new user. So I'm going to go call update and then I pass in the current username here like this. Okay, so this is going to do the trick. So you remember they're all very similar. The only difference is there's a current username that you have to pass so that we can look for the existing user before we try to change any of this information right here. And everything else is going to be the same when they're doing an update. They can actually send pictures and everything else. So this is going to be the, not a new user, but the updated user. Just to give it more context, and this is very important. Variable names are very important. They have to describe what they're doing. So this is the updated user. So I didn't really talk a lot about the response entity, but the response entity is everything that you need when you're sending the request back, right? So when you send a request back in Postman, you have HTTP status, you have headers, and then you have the body of the request, right? So that's what this class is. If we go into it, you can see that it takes a status and the body, right? And that's exactly what we're giving it here. We're giving it a body, which is gonna be the updated user, and the HTTP status. And the reason when I go into this, it takes us to this specific one is because we're not passing in any headers. If I was passing in headers, it would have taken me to this one. And you can see this takes headers, right? So that's what this is doing. This represents the whole response, like the status and the body and the headers and everything. Okay, so now we have the actual update. The next one we have to do is to find a user. So if I have, for instance, the username, which is in our instance one of the primary, not primary key, but a unique identifier for a user, right? So we should be able to find a user if we know just the username of the user. So let's go ahead and add that one. I'm gonna come down there, and then here I'm gonna add another request, and that's gonna be a get mapping because we're not saving anything to the database, and as we're doing in these two examples, which is why those are post requests. But here we're just getting information, like we're passing in an identifier so that we can get some information. So in that case, it's gonna be a get mapping because we're not saving anything. So I'm gonna map this to find. And then I'm gonna expect the username as parameters in the path. So I'm gonna call this username, and I'm gonna show you how I'm gonna get this value in a minute. And then once we start using the front end to call those endpoints, you'll see the difference between the request parameter and the path parameter. The path parameter is actually in the path, like in the URL path. So here, I'm gonna call the response entity because I'm returning an HTTP request, and in here I'm gonna say that's gonna be the user. Okay, so I'm gonna pass in the user, and then I'm gonna call this get user. Okay, so this is gonna return the a response with a user as the body of the request. That's what this means, which is what we're doing here. We're passing in the what type of body the response entity is gonna return. We didn't really have to do this. We could have just done this, which means anything, but just to be specific, we can do it like that. So here, then I need to get this username here. That's gonna be in the path, right? So all I have to do now is use an annotation called path param. And I path variable, and then here I pass in the name of the path variable that I'm looking for, which in this case is username, and I have to pass it in as a string, and then here I'm gonna pass it in to the method as a string, and I'm gonna give it the same name. Okay, So now we have the username from the path into the method, and we can use it to do whatever we want. In that case, since we're looking for a user, it's going to return a user. So again, user, and we're going to call in the user service. So user service, and we need to call in find user by username. And then in here, we pass in the username that we received from the request. So once we have that user, again, we just have to return that user. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy that line up here. And then just pass down there. And then I'm going to change this to user. Okay. And we're done. So you can see how this is very clean. The controller or the resource is very clean because we're handling all of the exception in this class, right? You remember we worked on this class to handle all of the exceptions. So that keeps the code very decoupled and clean. And it's also very easy to expand and very scalable. So you can see how I don't have any try-catch blocks here because I'm handling everything in a separate class altogether. Okay, so that's why this looks so nice and everything. So here I have a method to get one user by passing in the username. The next we have to do, the next method we have to implement is another one to get a list of all the user. So I'm going to copy that one and I'm going to paste it here. It's also going to be a get request because we're getting a list of all the users. So I'm going to call this list. So this is going to be mapping to, if you remember, user and then list. So that way, by just looking at the URL, the client will know, well, I'm getting a list of users. And again, this is not going to return a simple user. And I'm going to call this get. Let's do get all users. And then here, I'm not returning one user. I'm returning a list of user or a collection of users. So I can call the list and pass it in here as well. Just like that, which is saying I'm returning a list of users, right? And I'm already getting an error here because right now I'm returning one user. So I'm going to remove that line here. Also remove this because we're not getting any parameters. They're just sending a request to get all the users. And so now what I have to do is to create a list of users. So I'm going to do list of user and I'm going to call it users and I'm going to call the user service and I'm just going to go get users. And this is going to return me the list of all the users and I can pass this list into the body of the method with HTTP code OK, which means everything went well. Next one we have to do is to set the password of the user. So if the user needs to reset their password, we have to give him a way to pass in their email and then send them an email to their email address so that they can reset their password. So here I'm going to call this, I'm going to map this to reset password. And then here, of course, we have to get the email. We're going to get this as a path variable. So I'm going to pass in here. Oops. And here I'm going to say email, right? And we're going to do something very similar here. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to call this reset password because that's what it's doing. And in here, I'm going to get the email, right? And I'm going to call this email. So once I get the email, right? You remember the reset password doesn't return anything. So I'm not going to have anything, any variable here. And then here, I'm going to delete this. And then I'm going to call on the service, reset password, and then pass in the email, right? So we have to throw some exceptions here. So I'm going to, add this to the signature of the method. And here, I'm going to return, I'm going to create another method, like a private method down there, so that I can process this request, so that I can return a response entity like this. So I'm going to call it response, and in the response, I'm going to pass in the HTTP status like this, and then I'm going to pass in some string like email sent to, and then I pass in, I'm going to put a colon here, and then I'm going to pass in the email. And we're going to refactor this in a minute, and then I pass in the email. Right, so here I'm gonna go ahead and create this method down there, and we're gonna work on this in a minute, but this is gonna return a response entity of HTTP response, which is the response that we created. So here I'm gonna do HTTP response, which is our class from our domain. Okay, so now that we have that, we're gonna work on this in a minute, so don't worry if it's giving us an error right now. And we're also gonna pass this response entity here, because here we're not returning a list. Okay, so I'm gonna change this because it's not very descriptive. So I'm gonna do an email with a new password was sent to. Okay, so that makes more sense. That way they know exactly what happens. And I'm gonna turn this into a constant. I'm gonna right click, go to refactor, and then enter this constant. And then I'm gonna just say email underscore sent. So now I have this like this. So I'm gonna show you what this is gonna return. It's probably gonna return an HTTP response with whatever HTTP status that they pass in, and this is gonna be the message. So we're gonna work on this in the next few lectures, so that should be all we have to do now. So I'll see you in the next lecture.